Today I'm going to be talking about ethical risk maturity model and the framework actually, which is something like a maturity model. But the reason I really got into this was because I kept seeing my little statistic is the number of reached records per population in the United States. And usually the number of reached records is about 360 million, which is approximately equal to the population of the United States, or higher than that, or even double that. So, so I kind of got this picture that security is not well funded in industry. You know, breaches are ransom, crime pays, which is ransomware. So if you think about risk, usually you pay for risk up to the point of, you know, you pay for controls up to the point of your risk, and effectively the world is not. If you look at the world itself, it obviously is not paying enough for security. One of the other things you can think about is really that we've eradicated all sorts of diseases. We've spent a lot of time, you know, eradicating and paying for diseases to go away, but that isn't true in security. So the question is are companies, you know, only looking for profit? Is there a lack of interest? Is it an engineering problem? And what is ethical risk? And you know, how can we help to solve this problem from an ethical risk perspective? So I developed a model, and it's really based on the next slide, but let me introduce it anyway. The first one is risk immature. It's those small businesses that have no clue that they need to be concerned about risk. And then there's self-protection, which a lot of companies are at, which basically we protect our organization. And then there's the next level up, which is compliance, which is we need to adhere to laws. We're going to try to adhere to laws. And then there's stakeholder concern, which is, you know, being concerned with customers, but also being concerned with our employees, our financiers, our suppliers, our community, the people we do business with every day. And then the top is societal concern, and this is concern for the society and environment. Now this model really came out of or corresponds with Kohlberg's levels of moral judgment and his 6 stages, which are the bottom 2. And Kohlberg is a psychologist, and so he basically said that, you know, at the lowest stage, we have the pre-conventional morality, respect for power and punishment, and really the 2 stages that are part of that is obedience to authority, and we benefit each other, mutual deals. So you can kind of think of that kid who screams in order to get the candy he wants, right? You know, and we'll make a deal. I'll stop screaming if you give me the candy that I want. The next level up is conventional morality, which is social values and rules. And this is social approval, good versus bad. And we all know what society approves and what they don't approve. Part of that is how we dress every day. And the next is obey social, legal, and religious laws, depending on what you practice, basically. And then there's the post-conventional justice and welfare, which is to benefit society, often trying to change laws, and ethical principles over social norms. Now, Piaget is basically in the education world, and he teaches, he basically talks about how children learn ethical values, and what they go through is the pre-moral egocentrism, respect for authority and rules. The second level is cooperation and mutual respect. And then there's the autonomous level, which is reciprocity and equality. At the business level, we have Friedman and Freeman, and I will talk about them as I go through the different levels. So let's start off with risk immature. And risk immature are those small businesses that have no clue that they should be concerned about risk or security for that matter. The two steps here would be adopt a standardized risk process, which you guys are all probably fairly familiar with, at least have some understanding of. But the other is create a culture of risk communication. And this is really deals with ethics. So let me go over what's involved with that. The first is involve business management. So basically, business, the management will never buy into something that they don't understand very well. And so it is important that they go through, that they help to develop the risk scenarios. And risk scenarios are stories that describe how an actor might implement a threat to an asset via an event with a time frame. So it's really important just to include them. The next is creating a culture of communication and responsibility. And this really hits from both sides. One side is from the manager side. And I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting and you've suggested something and the manager basically poo-poos your idea. Then you're not likely to speak up again on that idea or even on others. And effectively, employees must feel comfortable asking for help, reporting ethical issues and bad news to management without being dismissed. And basically, business management understands that loyalty comes from ethical leadership and employee contribution to decision making. So from the employee side, employees also must communicate effectively with management. There's really two parts to this. One part is to basically ask until their questions are answered, which probably is going to get them in a little bit of trouble. But effectively ask nicely, well, what happens if this happens, until there is at least some form of an answer coming back. But the second thing that needs to happen is that as technical people, very often we know that we have a technical vocabulary and it's hard to communicate that to management. And so effectively we can say, well, that issue occurred because of a technical issue. And that excuses us. But on the other hand, maybe we should be saying, because we have an older firewall, and if we had a newer one, then perhaps this problem wouldn't have occurred. So, well, not perhaps, then this problem would not have occurred because it would have caught this. So the communication has to happen on both sides. The next is to document and communicate risk findings. And I think a lot of people in the security world can get frustrated because their security recommendations don't go anywhere, or don't go as far as they would like it to. And effectively, I'm basically a CRISC and a CISA, ISACA, CRISC and ISACA, CISA, Certified Information Systems Auditor. And one of the things that they emphasize is, okay, there's the RACI, which stands for Responsible, Accountable, Consultant, and Informed. And basically, management is responsible for making decisions. You aren't, if you're a security professional, you aren't responsible for that. So effectively, your job is to inform them, and then their job is to make the decision, and you can't feel guilty about their decision. So that is, all you can really do is inform them, and then, document your recommendations, and make sure that that their decisions are documented. Next, we're going to go on to the self-protection level. And the self-protection level really comes out of Milton Friedman, who wrote, what does it mean to say that the corporate executive has a social responsibility in his capacity as a businessman? If this statement is not pure rhetoric, it must mean that he is to act in some way that is not in the interest of his employers. For example, that he is to refrain from increasing the price of a product in order to contribute to the social objective of preventing inflation, even though a price increase would be the best interest of the corporation, or that he is to make expenditures on reducing pollution beyond the amount that is in the best interest of the corporation, or that is required by law in order to contribute to the social objective of improving the environment. Now, we know that a lot of organizations now are concerned about the environment. They are spending money beyond what they need to to adhere to regulation. So basically, this is one popular ideology, but a number of organizations go beyond it. The self-protection level, obviously you need to convince management of why they need to spend on security. And so it's a good idea to look at how it's going to protect them. On average, 5% of revenue is lost annually due to fraud. That is across decades and decades. It is also across countries. That it's at least that much. So effectively, and there's some additional statistics there, but the key practices here at the higher level are to train to evaluate fraud, security, business risk, manage for organizational sustainability, and there I don't mean environmental. Calculate quantitative risk analysis for the organization. So let's look at some of the specifics under that. So the first is provide an anonymous reporting mechanism for ethical violations. And basically, again, another statistic that shows up again and again, year after year, across continents, is that the most popular way of finding fraud is to have some way of getting tips. Okay, so basically people, including customers, vendors, and employees really want some anonymous way of reporting tips, either anonymous or they can be in person. So this is the most popular way of detecting detecting fraud. The next is develop a code of ethics addressing organizational sustainability. One of the things that I think is really interesting is the CRISC manual, CRISC being certification for risk and information systems controls. They explicitly recognize that management may choose to ignore regulation when the cost of compliance exceeds the law's fines or consequences, which basically means that even though the CRISC manual does talk about how you should handle regulation, they recognize that evidently it is perfectly okay not to adhere to it. Unfortunately, with no code of ethics, basically each employee's home moral behavior is going to equal their business moral behavior. So at that point, you need some kind of code of ethics. Now, at this level, okay, which is the self-protection, a lot of the code of ethics tends to basically protect management. So it'll say something like, members should promote management's understanding of information processing methods and procedures. Members owe trust to their employers to guard the employer's interests, and to advise the employers wisely and honestly. The next is pricing insurance with discounts for controls. So basically, obviously one risk mechanism to handle risk, one treatment to handle risk, is to use insurance, to purchase insurance. And what does insurance do? Well, it protects you, but it means that you don't have to implement any controls. In other words, it doesn't make the problem any better at all. Okay, so I'll just give an example of this. Because I was interested in this ethical risk concept, I wrote a paper on school shootings, and basically looked at what is the probability that a school shooting is going to happen, And then what is the impact if it does happen? And believe it or not, and I used various ethical, I kind of used this to say, well, let's look at, if we funded it this way or that way or some other way, how would it turn out? Well, it turns out that even large universities, really large universities, should spend about, at most, $3,000 a year to protect students. And that includes the most ethical, standards for risk. So basically, with less, it might be, below 1,000. Fortunately, I work at University of Wisconsin-Parkside, where we can lock the doors from the inside of each of the classrooms. And they spent a heck of a lot more than $3,000 to accomplish that. So I'm eternally grateful that they didn't do good quantitative risk for that. And now we're going to go into compliance concern. And compliance concern is obviously concerned with regulation and courts and that kind of thing. So economist Ronald Coase is the person that I'm talking about here. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about what he said is that there's really two sides to every story, and this is true for regulation and for like lawsuits, okay? And that is that one side wants to do business and the other side doesn't want to get hurt. And one possibility is that if you take away this, then the person who doesn't want to get hurt doesn't get hurt, but on the other hand, you really hurt the employer, kind of deal. And the other possibility is that you just help the employer and potentially really hurt the customers or the people in the society. And so there needs to be a balance between the two, which I thought was interesting in him pointing that out. Now, I think with compliance concern, in order to raise your management to that level, if they are not, you kind of have to really talk dollar figures, because dollar figures speak to management. And so I put some figures together. Capital One was fined $80 million. Wendy's was fined $50 million, and this is regulatory, okay? Texas paid $3.2 million. Texas Hospital Target paid $18.5 million. And Google was fined 50 million euros with GDPR. So if that doesn't get people's attention, I'm not sure what would. But effectively, key practices at the highest level include train for compliance risk, value legal adherence within management, address regulation fully, consider legal responsibility beyond regulation, and follow software standards for quality, security, and safety. And we'll go into some of those aspects. So the first one is lead ethically. In other words, management has to exemplify what they want from their employees. So management should exemplify, train for, award, and promote good ethical behavior and correct bad behaviors, both in person and in training. And as you may notice, I actually went a little bit into the business as well as the security stuff in this paper, and talked about fraud. But the FSGO is regulation relating to business ethics, and they require that a high-level management position or person be assigned overall responsibility for compliance and ethics in an organization. The next is assign ethical risk accountability. So basically, how does this happen in an organization? And let's start with the executives. They have to establish a culture of safety. The project managers must ensure safety is given due consideration. And then developers also have some responsibility. They have to identify compliance or moral problems, collect facts and evaluate alternative solutions, implement the solution, and monitor results as feedback. Now, users also are involved in this. They are responsible for their actions and may need training for proper product operation. Okay, the next is addressing regulation, and there's various aspects to this. So the first thing is, and this is basically from CRISC more than anything else, develop a compliance-oriented business impact analysis for privacy regulation and privacy impact analysis, for example. So you need to develop scenarios to demonstrate how the regulation affects the business. The scenarios are the stories. Quantify the cost of not adhering to regulation. Consider civil law and third-party liabilities such as contracts, intellectual property, and privacy. And evaluate international regulations as well, since many companies operate in multiple countries at any time. And the next concern is rule versus the intent of the law. One of the things that Friedman will say later on in the presentation is that when regulation needs to be rewritten, that is a failure of management. Because obviously they didn't do it well enough. The next, which really kind of goes into that lawsuit aspect, is evaluate product liability. And one of the major areas right now that are ripe for liability issues is artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence right now often trains on biased manual systems, and so effectively what they turn out is biased decisions, and those biased decisions are occurring in criminal justice, healthcare, employment, and education. And basically this perpetuates systemic harm, causing long-term maltreatment that basically affects people's lives and deaths. Effectively, what should happen from an engineering perspective is to consider how the algorithm will likely impact special groups. Is it accurate and fair? In other words, I know in one study they basically looked at the rate of recidivism for people who were by the judicial system, and whether people should be able to be put on parole. And they found out the number one factor was your race as to whether you got the parole or not. Consider how the algorithm will likely impact special groups. Is it fair, accurate, and fair? Observe use and implementation, evaluating rate of fairness on special groups. So before you implement it, look at the rate. After you implement it, see how it's handled, and then publicize how the algorithm works in order to promote transparency. Manage projects responsibly. Those people who are in development know that sometimes the most serious concern is schedules, and unfortunately, this may lead to a series of lies and bad decisions. With products being delivered late, or missing features, or products are lacking quality and or documentation. So it is important to manage those projects responsibly, and a way to do that is realistic project management, comprehensive risk management, good communication, quality software development standards, a code of conduct, and ethical training. Develop and follow soft law. So in the legal situation, basically, if you can show that you have adhered to the law, and particularly its intent, then and bad things happen to you anyway, you get off a lot easier, if not entirely. And in many places there is no law. So one way that companies basically make sure that they can protect themselves is to develop soft law. Now, soft law is not law that's that's regulated by legislators. But basically, it's industry groups that get together that say this is what a quality standard is. And so there's a number of different soft laws that have been developed for this purpose. A number of organizations participate in, and they're listed here. Configure software for policy choice, and basically, when you're developing software, very often you may have one customer in mind for who you're planning to sell this to, but effectively, the worldwide implementation of this, or shall we say, being able to sell worldwide, is very attractive. But a lot of nations have a lot of different regulations. So if you can configure the software for the particular regulations, it means that that basically you may be able to sell more, which actually adheres to the regulation, as well as what the companies are interested in. So if you talk to different companies, they may have different standards, and if you can if you make those different options configurable, then at that point, this is a good thing for adhering to regulation. Next, we're going to go into stakeholder concern, and this is by Edward Freeman, and he basically said in one of his books, so even if the ideologues who insist that the only legitimate purpose of a business is to maximize shareholder value or maximize profits, the only way to do that is to create great products and service that customers want to buy. He also said that deception erodes trust, and trust is required for economic transactions. Business management must take responsibility for the effects of their actions, including defending themselves to 60 Minutes reporters. When new regulation or litigation arises, the implication is business management failure. So basically the idea of stakeholder concern is that we're concerned with how our customers feel, that we're making our customers happy. Our employees want to be loyal to us. Our vendors, financiers, all are interested in, in working. We work well with them. Okay, in a risk scenario, I thought was really interesting was in the news, and that is that the Russian hackers offered a Russian-speaking Tesla employee $1 million to install a ransomware attack. And this Tesla employee turned it down and actually worked with law enforcement. But certainly, if you're a corporation, can you be pretty well assured that all of your employees like you enough to turn down a $1 million bribe? I think that's a lot to ask for, but still, I think it raises the question. So some of the key practices are: learn the context of the business process and or product development, manage with a view toward all stakeholders, discuss the qualitative impact of risk affecting all stakeholders, evaluate the impact of risk quantitatively, inform, communicate ethical risk to stakeholders, and evaluate risk and software implementation for all stakeholders. So let's go through some of those. Learn the context of the business process and or product development. Well, very often, if you talk to engineers about what is a security concern, there's only a few things they will come up with, which is basically malware, firewalls, that kind of thing. It's very limited. They stay only within the security realm. They don't look at the business realm at all. So if you're dealing with healthcare, they're not necessarily looking at social engineering, for example, that could happen within that business realm. And so it's important for engineers to not just look, to not just think, okay, it's only about firewalls and intrusion detection and logs and that kind of thing. So developers must understand the context, legal and ethical requirements of the application. They need to understand the complex social environment that includes their clients, their users, the customers, and the business, and as well as understanding the things related to the software specialty, including security and safety implications, which of course many developers don't even get that far. So the next thing is as the world changes, different ethical decisions may arise yearly, so that becomes important as well. The next issue is personalized risk, and one of the things I was thinking about last night was that most value of life estimates often come out of what a person will earn through the rest of their life. And so I said, well, okay, let's just take $50,000, which I think most people in this room, if they're not making more than that, then they will be very soon. But effectively, the average American probably might be a little closer to that range. $50,000, 40 years, is basically $2 million. So that puts the value of life at about $2 million for the average American. Is there anyone in this room who would consider their life as being valued just at $2 million? Okay, not at all. I'm sure everyone is well above that. And in fact, actually, when studies have been done, where you ask people to work on skyscrapers, for example, how much are you willing to, how much do you need to earn in order to build on some of the skyscrapers in the building of that? They can come to other estimates of how people value their life. And so the US EPA has estimated life at 7.4 million, and a study in 1984 was 2 to 8 million, with one I think at 12 million. Okay, so basically one issue needs to be that we need to value life realistically in these risk analyses, quantitative risk analyses. The solution is really to include employees and customers in risk decisions. And one issue I'll be talking more about is the public tend to see risk as a binary moral decision, not as a probability. So that should be something to be aware of. Evaluate trade-offs of concern. So any kind of decision, including development or, for that matter, business decision, you have to make trade-offs between different values. So on the right-hand side, we can see that, particularly in development, you might want to, you have to get owner values and the user values, as well as then extract the process requirements and the product requirements for development. On the left-hand side, we see a number of arrows, and basically, as we're working with a decision, we can draw lines somewhere along these arrows to say that, yeah, this should be, this is this reliable, but it needs to be more reliable. That's this secure, but it needs to be more secure, for example. And then you can start trading off some of those values. Consider risk beyond the expected. Broad framing considers worst case scenarios and should be permitted to be considered. And the Vision Zero principle considers how to control for no risk of death or severe harm. Evaluate the outrage factor. Sandman worked with risk, where he says, normal risk is likelihood times impact. But what if we add in an outrage factor? Okay, so now risk is equal to the annual loss expectancy is equal to likelihood times impact plus outrage. And outrage is the employee, is basically society's consideration of this. And basically, things that are not in control, that affect human life, and are morally problematic, okay, would tend to increase that value of the outrage in the public's understanding. And this is why after 3 Mile Island nuclear facilities were not built. So the public tends to focus on the moral aspects of risk, including what risks are deemed acceptable and why, what will happen if the risk actually occurs. And providing facts and statistics does not solve the ethical dilemmas, nor does it lower the controversy. And public controversy is in fact an indicator of an unresolved moral issue. And I think if you look at the newspapers today, you'll see a number of moral issues that are problematic, where we're not agreeing on things. So it is, I think, you know, actually in the engineering world, if you look at you know, I basically look at IEEE, you know, a lot of those papers, and the ones related to electrical engineering and engineering in general, basically they're concerned about safety, and they have ways of really building that in. And of course that ends up going into regulation and standards and so on and so forth. But in software, a lot of times even security doesn't make it. And so effectively, you know, we don't, sometimes security will go in last, and effectively it, in a number of software development, I would assume that that's still true. So effectively, what engineering does is really describes the inherent risk to customers and sells them a safer product. And we need to do more of that. And the only way really to do that is to put good statistics together to sell the security in the product, you know, to the owner so that they understand the implications of it much better. If the customer chooses a less safe product, the company refuses to transact, or contractual agreements should absolve the engineering company of responsibility, so that known liability is explicitly accepted by the customer. And if they had to sign that contract, then I think that might be a different issue. Address risk in software. One process for doing this goes through the following stages. Identify the project type and its direct and extended stakeholders. 2, identify the task per phase of the software development project. 3, use structured questions to develop a map of associations between each task and its related stakeholders. And 4, analyze risk discovered by the mapping in order to articulate the severity of the project risks and the risk treatment strategy. Some of the important metrics related to this is how much in advance you can see that a failure is going to happen. That's really the idea of certainty. How well the risk is understood and known. Controllability is your ability to control harm. So something happens, but can you control it after after the fact? And then severity is basically what we're used to, which is considers the level of harm done, the scale, and its future impact. Now, what engineering does, if you look at, for example, I think this actually comes from quite a few years ago, they may have changed it, but safer cars, for example, they first developed safety goals. And then from the safety goals, they defined functional safety requirements. And from the functional safety requirements, they developed technical safety requirements. So basically the technicals, as an industry group, they're putting together functional safety requirements which then when it goes to the individual company, those become technical safety requirements. And then, of course, there's always verification, which ensures compliance of the design. Now let's look at the highest level, which is a societal concern. And here we're looking at philosophical theories. Okay, so basically it includes utilitarianism theory, which tries to basically tries to make the most people happy as possible. Deontological ethics, which is similar to the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And what's important there is the motive for your actions. And then there's virtue ethics, which is concerned about the character of an entity and on avoiding vice. So virtue ethics can also be applied to the organizational level by improving internal organizational qualities. If we think about, I think the scenarios here, I actually first did a part of this presentation to some businessmen, and the year I did it, which was about 2 years ago, California had just gone through some horrendous fires where 12,000 lightning strikes in 3 weeks sparked almost 24 major fires. 5 million acres burned, destroyed homes, thousands fled. So, and most recently I've also talked to people from, someone from Puerto Rico who basically has moved from there because Hurricane Katrina, which was a long time ago now, they just have not recovered. They just, they have not recovered, and she eventually gave up and moved away. The key practices: train and think in ethics, manage considering the societal impact of decisions, discuss the societal impact of risk qualitatively, and evaluate the impact of risk quantitatively. And let's go through some of those. Train and think in ethics, I really talked about those 3 ethical, philosophies, shall we say. And I think the one that I'm going to expand on a little bit is the deontological. And that is, it says universal application, do unto others. And really, what they say is, can any moral behavior be done by everyone in the world? And effectively, an example there is lying. Does society work if everyone lies? And we're actually going to find out the result of that. Unfortunately, possibly very soon, and we're seeing the effects of that right now. Adopt a code of ethics that addresses societal concerns. Now, we talked about the code of ethics before in the self-protection, and the self-protection is work loyally with management. Now, I didn't put, actually, this particular one is in each one of the levels, but I want to contrast them here. So, self-protection, work loyally with management. Compliance concern would potentially, in addition to that, add obey the laws and meet contracts carefully. If you were at stakeholder concern, you're going to say treat the customers, vendors, and employees with respect. And if you're at the societal concern level, which is a part of where IEEE and ACM are, if you look at their code of ethics. ACM says the public good is always the primary consideration. So you can see there that, ACM and IEEE actually are at the societal concern level. Discuss the societal impact of risk qualitatively. So again, think outside the engineer role. Consider societal risk broadly. In other words, we tend to think only of the business, and we need to open that up to think more broadly. One way of doing that is to is normally we calculate risk actually I think that's coming up, so maybe I shouldn't talk about it. But we look at risk only from the perspective of an organization, right? As people, we look at risk from a personal perspective. And I think if we think about whether we're buying, whether we are buying antivirus software or we are buying insurance for ourselves, for our identity theft. Okay, many of us are not spending there. I think, okay, so the last one is avoid ignoring undesirable decisions. So here's the slide that really kind of shows the personal level, the organizational level, and the society level. And so addressing all three, and I think one of the interests that I've got is to look at it from a publication level, at least from the society level. So this is the whole thing. The conclusion, the benefits for this is that the lower levels to the compliance, certainly there's more stability, there's fewer lawsuits, there's rare regulatory judgments, and improved community reputation. But if we look at the higher levels, which are not quite so popular with business, is that there's new products, potentially revolutionary. And I think we're seeing that with a number of forward-thinking organizations. There's better customer relationships, better long-term employee-vendor relationships, long-term community respect, and a feeling of pride and goodwill. So one thing I'm asking is that if there is a survey, and unfortunately there is, okay. So basically the www, the bottom one, the Word doc, ethical risk, that will bring you to kind of some questions that I have formulated that can help you analyze where you are. One of the things that actually, let me go back to here, there's really 4 questionnaires, and one of them is for risk people, another one's for management, another one's for compliance or legal, and the other one's for development and engineering. So there are surveys there, and you could actually help me publish in this area if you want to take one of those surveys. Unfortunately, I should have a link that goes to a page where you can easily click on this as opposed to copying down all those alphabet, but unfortunately I don't have that. So basically, if you want to pick one, if you're out in industry, the best one that fits you and fill that in, the one thing I would say is that would help. It is anonymous. And yes, I have some people taking pictures of it. Please do. That would be wonderful. And please do fill that in, and that will help me figure out where organizations kind of are doing well, where they may not be doing quite so well. Yeah, so are there any questions? Yeah.
So sometimes could it be that you focused on the wrong area in risk? For the example with the 3 Mile Island, which I actually grew up in that area, so I'm very familiar with. Instead of focusing on, oh my gosh, look what happened at the nuclear power plant, could it be that we should have focused on, oh my gosh, look what happens when we eat too many donuts, because that was actually really the cause of the accident. And maybe that's part of the problems we're having with ethical risks.
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not so sure. I think a lot of people eat donuts, and I don't know if that all becomes a disaster. So maybe there's something else other than the donuts. Well, maybe what they did is eating at the controls as opposed to.
Actually,
with sugar?
No, the warning light was covered by the particular region. You didn't know that?
No,
Yeah, no, that's actually really what the consul was here and his stomach was kind of like this.
Well, you know what, maybe then what should be done is that they have a table where they can put things down that doesn't have controls on it or things, you know, and then, because unfortunately people are always going to continue to eat or do whatever, particularly if they're working overtime and that kind of stuff. So, so in the engineering of it, it's also possible to address that, but it's an interesting question. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Is it possible to get some of these slides? I was interested in the one where you kind of go through the breakdown of the different, the 4 levels compared to the other frameworks, and then also the one we just had the 4 level stack. Can you share that?
You know, right now I have www.cs.uwp.edu staff Lincke ethical risk. Okay, now the last 2 days have been a disaster for me. My furnace broke. I wanted to go to this conference. I'm not sure. Okay, it's over? 5 minutes. Oh, okay, thank you. So unfortunately, I didn't get this updated there, but I will go home and get this updated to www.cs.uwp staff Lincke ethical risk. I will have it up there. If you want to get these slides, you can get them there. It's just that unfortunately the last 2 days have been a disaster for me. So
the survey links also on your webpage?
the survey links are not, but I will put them on there. You know, I mean, maybe that's what I should do. I can probably get them on there and just make it easy for you. Right now, you can download some of those questions, but I think actually the survey are updated from what is actually even on yeah. So yeah. Other questions? I think there was one over here. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I saw that you had a hazard versus outrage. How do we, like, what metric do we use for outrage, and how do you gauge that preemptively? Like, is there...
They don't really go into the outrage. They do have what he does document are about 8 or 9 different things that cause outrage. Okay, and I mentioned 3 of them. If it's life-threatening, if there's moral issues, and if you can't control it, okay, then it leads to outrage. But there's actually 8 of them, about 7 or 8 of them that Salmon talks about. Yeah. Yeah.
There's something that might help measure that. So if you've heard of Douglas Hubbard and how to measure anything in cybersecurity risk, he gives a great methodology on how to become a good estimator for risk things. I think it could be applied to outrage just as well as the other risk elements.
What was her name?
It's Douglas Hubbard, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk.
One of the things that's interesting, in fact, I probably would, it might be interesting for us to talk afterwards because it sounds like you have some additional insights here that would be good for me to know. Yeah, so, but if you really think of security, I think one of the issues is very often people's lives are not impacted, you know, they're life and death, they're not life and death situations, which is why people haven't taken it, you know, they haven't taken it as seriously. But I think once it starts getting into cars and, you know, I mean, it's really seriously in cars where there's, then all of a sudden the life and death will become much more of an impact. Yeah.
What do you think would be a better approach when you're dealing with morality across, like societal morality across the world where there's widely different varying views, and if you have an international business, do you just go to one extreme of whatever the most extreme is? Do you take an average of them?
I'm not, okay, so the question is you know, because the world has a lot of different views, you know, where should you shoot for? I think, okay, and maybe I'm not going to answer that the way you're expecting, but let me try and then you can ask again. I think companies need to specify what their goals are and then live by those goals and raise the values of, you know, because it is true that in many parts of the world, fraud is mostly, you know, friends, you know, what I do with friends. So it's corruption more than anything else. Whereas the United States, it's more asset misappropriation. And so effectively, it's really important to put people in place that can lead by example. and understand what the problems are in those different societies. Does that answer your question, or did you have a?
Yeah, pretty much so. My understanding is it's better to take just a general standpoint of whatever your business societal view of morality would be, as opposed to try to take a general standpoint.
Okay, so I think there is another question. A lot of times management, wherever management is, particularly top management, that's where the organization is, right? I mean, whatever level the top management is at, that's where the organization is. And so what happens if you're at a higher level than them, you know? And part of what I'm talking about in this is how you can move things at least a little bit, you know, that you understand our organization's at this level, how do I move it up a little bit? And so some of it is communicating, so you can look at your particular, you know, where my organization is, and then how I move it up is, you know, by communicating better, or you know, or by not being as concerned because it's management's prerogative at the very lowest level. So, or by potentially talking about things, you know, I mean, instead of talking about societal values, I mean, each one of these levels are good, right? I mean, you can't just go to societal level. You have to, you know, you have to go to compliance first, and then you go to, you know, valuing your customers, and then you go to societal values potentially. I mean, it is possible to move people a little bit, but really when it comes right down to it, all of these are important, and so you kind of have to see where your organization is, and very often the code of ethics will tell you exactly where it is. You know, you can see from the code of ethics exactly where your organization is. So, okay, I think our time is up, right? No, we have.
No, we got
It's it. Okay, time to go. Okay, thank you.